Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everybody. My name is, and I'll be your host for today's NCTR dialogue related to the missing children and unmarked burials. Um, let me start with this important message. We are broadcasting from the traditional lands of the Cree, Oji Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of Les Métis. Although we are broadcasting from Treaty 1 territory, we would like to extend a big, warm welcome to everyone who is watching from their communities across Canada and on the internet. We would also like to acknowledge the territories that our guests are speaking from tonight and today. Nous diffusons à partir des terres traditionnelles.
We are broadcasting live from original lands of the Cree, the Oshie Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. While we are broadcasting from lands that are subject to Treaty 1, we welcome all those who are listening to us across the country and on internet. We'd like also to acknowledge the territories of our guests today.
NCTR and researchers that can help identify the missing children and unmarked burials. This panel will discuss the steps to find and locate the children, our children, the technology used, such as ground penetrating radar, and how important records are in finding and identifying these children. They will also review how archaeology, anthropology, and forensic pathology can support these communities, our communities, in doing this important work. And this event is being broadcast on Facebook live en français and in English. Today, we are joined by four incredible voices from across Canada. I'll present them. Raymond Frogner, Dr. Kona Williams, Dr. Kisha Supernant, and Dr. Eldon Yellowhorn. Each panelist will have 10 to 15 minutes to share with the audience a bit of their work, as well as to answer a few directed questions. Additionally, we will close the dialogue with questions and an answer period. So please forward your questions through the chat function. All peoples are invited to join our conversation, even the ones in Ottawa. Voila. So I start to invite Raymond Frogner to introduce himself. Raymond, c'est à toi.
Tanse, Raymond Frogner, Netigason, Notari Oscar Egua, Nigari Doris, Netatoskan, National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Hello, my name is Raymond Frogner. I am the head of the archives for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. I'm speaking to you today from the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Now, if I can only share the screen. Okay, I believe that's working. I wish to begin my talk with an observation on why we are here. Since the end of May, and the Te Sequepemc First Nation announcement, the center has been in a state of mourning. We have held several ceremonies led by the spiritual guides of our center. This Thursday and Friday, we attend 2 days of ceremonies at Turtle Lodge in honor of the lost children. These ceremonies will involve the National Council of Elders and several other spiritual guides, knowledge keepers, and representatives of Indigenous societies living across the country. There will be a public announcement on July 21st resulting from these meetings. We know this is just the beginning and we need to respond to these events with a clear mind. I say this because it's difficult to keep one's head from spinning as we consider all the generational implications of what has happened in the last 2 months. In my discussion, I'd like to set out the case for a national data repository to assist Indigenous communities to store their research data as they conduct unmarked burial investigations across the country. I'll detail this repository and I'll situate this project in the goals of the NCTR Archives to be decolonizing archives, supporting Indigenous reconciliation, resurgence, and planting the seeds to grow self-determined Indigenous communities ready to engage with settler societies as equals, walking parallel but separate paths. Because the reality is that there will always be an ongoing relationship between Indigenous and settler societies, it is up to us to decide what we want this relationship to look like. We can nurture it, or we can continue to ignore the systemic exploitation of Indigenous peoples that has been the basis of this relationship throughout the colonial era. To begin, the knowledge of unmarked burials of Indigenous children has always been well known. Knowledge keepers, elders, community members, and survivors have shared these stories in oral histories, ceremonies, private conversations, and local media for decades. But these profound and intractable histories have never been a significant component of our school curriculum, discussed in our mainstream media, ruled on in our courts, or commemorated and acknowledged in our institutions of cultural heritage. Even when the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was negotiated, it did not include specific reference to lost children and unmarked gravesites. Jerry Morasti, an Indigenous MP from Saskatchewan, successfully advocated in the House of Commons to have these issues addressed in the TRC mandate. So from the beginning, the investigation into missing children and unmarked gravesites has been an Indigenous initiative. Recognizing the importance of this issue to Indigenous peoples, the TRC included 5 calls to action in its final report that specifically address missing children and unmarked gravesites, calls 72 to 76. Although the TRC investigated missing children, they did not in any archival sense create a registry. At the end of the TRC's mandate in 2015, they had created several conflicting Excel spreadsheets that held the identified names of 3,672 children lost. In many cases, more research was required to fully understand these events. There was no preservation policy, access, or use policies for the data that TRC created, and it was not readily available for Indigenous communities. One of the NCTR's first projects was to build a so-called student death register responsible to Call to Action 72. By 2019, the NCTR had confirmed over 1,000 names that had still required clear confirmation in the TRC's final report. We'd created policies for access, use, preservation, and migrated and ordered the Excel spreadsheets into a relational database for better control, discoverability, and preservation of the information. The death register profiles each child with 15 fields of information, including cause of death, home community, and first language. It is only accessible to family members or by special permission. The NCTR also created an online memorial site to commemorate the lost children and the families left behind. The NCTR spent over 6 months consulting with Indigenous communities across the country to determine the social protocols for commemorating the lost children in an online manner. In December 2020, the NCTR finished its negotiations with Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs to complete all research into missing children in its archival holdings. The TRC had investigated approximately 1 million of the 5 million documents it had collected as it fulfilled its mandate to create as complete as possible a history and legacy of the residential school system. The NCTR verified these results and expanded on the investigations. The NCTR fully identified 4,172 children, 17 children lost at residential schools. The December 2020 agreement was struck to fund the NCTR to research the several million remaining records. In this plan, the NCTR researchers would also note any information on unmarked burials. The idea was that once missing children had been identified to the greatest level possible, the NCTR, under the guidance of Indigenous communities, would then begin to set out on a plan to support investigating unmarked burials. We explained this plan to CERNA, who had expressed willingness to offer funding. Shortly after that, the Kamloops news broke, and since then, our plans have been drastically changed. While the NCTR was investigating the lost children, it was also building digital capacity. This is crucial to recognize in our data repository proposal. The NCTR has spent the last 2 years developing an IT infrastructure to manage projects such as a data repository for unmarked burial research. In November 2020, the NCTR won a Canada Foundation for Innovation grant for the value of $6,007,000. This digital capacity forms the second component of the NCTR repository project for unmarked burials. The CFI grant will fund an upgrade to the IT infrastructure to better manage, technically and culturally, the NCTR's digital material. Two, they will collaborate with the National Film Board to preserve and make accessible the over 7,000 survivor statements in digital AV formats. It will design free data workshops with community representatives to consult the NCTR data in an Indigenous-driven approach. And finally, it will design an open source IT platform to support a collaborative national register of unmarked grave sites. All of these developments funded by the CFI grant will assist some way in the management of the data concerning unmarked burials. The NCTR has come to a point where it has not only a much better control over its records, it has capacity to support large-scale digital projects, such as the multiple community-led investigations into unmarked burials. The NCTR data repository proposal offers a data repository for communities to use in their individual investigations. Communities can log in and upload their research onto this protected repository during investigations. They'll have their own space for storage, use, and sharing data amongst investigators and community members. This approach has many benefits for communities. Communities avoid the resource burden of systems administration, such as upgrades, patches, licensing, etc. Data will remain authentic and reliable. The NCTR can manage version control, custody, access, and other details that convey legal weight to these documents under the guidance of Indigenous communities. There will be consistency of description when uploading data to support future preservation and research. It will be free for community use, and a secure second copy of research data could be preserved as archival records when the research is completed. And finally, there will be free database training for Indigenous community members. I'm willing to discuss all the technical details of this proposal as time permits. I'd like to add just now a few words to understand the role of a national data repository for Indigenous communities' struggle for rights, resurgence, and self-determination. In support of Indigenous society's struggle for self-determination, the NCTR is attempting to create a decolonizing archive. Such an approach recognizes the embedded colonial role public archives have played in the colonial dispossession of Indigenous society. It is an attempt to recognize the shared values of social memory. It questions our European inherited languages of description and reflection in our houses of heritage and memory. There is no roadmap or existing standard to create a decolonizing archive, but some of these qualities include: 1, recognize the embedded colonizing role played by traditional archives. 2, recognize that archival evidence is not a fact. It's a matrix of relationships, and like all relationships, it's vulnerable to trust and mistrust, good faith and manipulation. 3, it does not preserve records frozen in time, but recognizes their dynamic, evolving meaning. 4, it supports cognitive practices, knowledge methods, and social protocols of Indigenous communities. 5, it builds on diverse genres of social memory, ceremony, regalia, performance, to create a holistic center of social memory, recognizing spiritual and environmental in the context of local social sanction. And finally, it offers a safe and accessible space for Indigenous peoples to remember and freely access, share, and express their views on the legacy and meaning of the residential school experience. In conclusion, it may seem hard to find a way forward in these difficult times, but the knowledge gained from these investigations of unmarked grave sites is ultimately a public good. It will allow us to interrogate colonial oppression and bring some closure to those families left behind. A full accounting of our colonial past is the first necessary step to build a society premised on values of justice, respect, and human rights. Because we are what we choose to remember, but we're also what we choose to forget. It is time we learn from Indigenous beliefs of respect and caring for relationships. I'm reminded of the words of Indigenous legal scholar James Sakage Youngblood Henderson, who wrote of Indigenous philosophy, transforming systemic injustice into systemic justice. He wrote, "To create systemic justice in governing states, Indigenous peoples must encourage hope to prevail over past experiences, creativity over impossibility, constitutionalism over domination, prophecy over habit, kindness over the impersonal, place over time, solidarity over individualism, serenity over vulnerability, and empathic love and relationship over everything." It's with this hope that Indigenous worldviews can inform us in the direction of systemic justice that we propose a data repository in support of communities investigating sites of unmarked burials. Kinanis Komatina Wow. Thank you. That's all.
Bonjour. Our next speaker I invite to introduce herself is le Dr. Kisha Supernant. Please, s'il vous plaît.
Tanse, Kisha Supernant Tzikatson, Miskuti Wiskaigan, Egwa Manitu Sakaigan, Otinia, Limichifnia. Hello, I am Dr. Kisha Supernant. I am AT with deep family connections to Alberta, and I'm director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology at the University of Alberta, which is situated on Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homeland. And I'm calling in today from that territory and from the homeland of my family. I am also the chair of the Canadian Archaeological Association's working group on unmarked graves. And I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about the application of remote sensing, including ground penetrating radar, in this search for missing children. So I'm going to share my screen and go through a presentation. Just want to note that in this presentation, I will be talking about the unmarked graves of missing children from residential schools. The examples shown, however, are not from those particular contexts. They're from other burial contexts where we have been working to support communities with these technologies. So what I would like to provide for you today is a little bit of an overview of a process the Canadian Archaeological Association Working Group has developed what we're calling our Pathways document, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I'll then provide an introduction to two forms of remote sensing technologies that are often used in this search for unmarked grave locations, provide some examples of what we do when we collect information around unmarked graves and how we move from what we're seeing on the screen to interpreting a grave, and then provide some recommendations as communities seek to do this work. I want to start with this, is that in all the work that I do and my team does and the folks within the working group do, is that we follow very respectful practices. The idea is that we must respect the impacts that this work has on survivors, the families, communities, and the researchers as well. We follow community leads, so this work must be community and survivor-led as much as possible, honoring the importance of ceremony, both for the community but also for the teams that might be collecting information around these unmarked graves. We include, of course, the testimony of survivors and Indigenous knowledge around areas that are likely to have unmarked grave locations. Try to be as clear as possible about what the technology that we use can do and what it cannot do. And this is very, very important as this information circulates in all sorts of ways. Be responsive and provide results as quickly as possible, and always have very clear agreements around the information that's being collected belonging to the communities. So the Pathways document I mentioned, which is available on the Canadian Archaeological Association website, really emphasizes that remote sensing, which I will be focusing on today, is not the first step in doing work to find missing children. My colleague Raymond had talked about the archive and the importance of doing that work, but also the community and survivor knowledge and testimony is very important. And having information about the areas that might be targeted around residential schools is also essential, because the work of especially ground penetrating radar can be quite slow, and it shouldn't necessarily, not every area has an equal likelihood of having unmarked graves. And so working with community around those experiences and knowledge within community is extremely important as well. And then after that, there's the question of trying to provide results and communicate results, and then the next steps that might come once possible grave locations have been identified. I'm going to talk briefly about two forms of remote sensing. So there's aerial-based forms of remote sensing that archaeologists and anthropologists and other people have been using for some of these purposes. And then there's also ground-based remote sensing, which I'll talk about in a moment. For aerial-based remote sensing, there's a number of important areas that can be used to support the refinement of areas that might need further research. So this can include imagery that's collected via satellite, aerial photos, particularly historical aerial photos. Many parts of the lands we call Canada have aerial photos dating back certainly to the 1940s, and that information can be very valuable in reconstructing the landscapes around schools for over time and how things may have changed. We know many buildings are gone and that kind of thing. So those aerial photos are very valuable. And then we have new technologies where we can mount different forms of cameras and sensors onto drones or unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs. And these can provide detailed surface mapping and information about sometimes the subsurface as well. So the use of these technologies can be really helpful in the search for unmarked burials because it can cover a larger area in a shorter amount of time and help to narrow down the application of other forms of remote sensing. This is an example of drone-based photography in a graveyard. This is, of course, shared with permission, where certain areas of either mounding or depression, so changes in the actual topography of the surface itself, indicate possible grave locations. And using this drone photography, able to narrow down areas that are likely graves. So this is one application that can be useful. A second application, this is not from a grave context, but from another archaeological site that I've worked on, is called a multi-spectral imaging. What this does is it takes a photo which captures different spectrums of light, and those spectrums of light can indicate vegetation health. And when the ground is disturbed, whether it be from, in this case, a Métis cabin, or in another case from a grave, there is a possibility that we can detect the grave location based on the vegetation health. This is less proven than some other methods, but I think has great potential because it covers large areas in a short amount of time. Just quickly, some of the benefits and limitations of aerial methods are that aerial methods are quick. You can fly a drone over a fairly large area in a fairly short amount of time. There's that historical depth from aerial photos. It can indicate areas of interest. And if there are areas that have significant amounts of ground cover, like forested or bushy areas, a form of mapping called LiDAR can actually remove that bush and you can see the surface of the ground. So that can be quite valuable for this initial stage. It does generate a large amount of data. So data storage and data management becomes very important when you're dealing with aerial forms of remote sensing. It's not as well established in locating likely burials. And it is very much dependent on the history of that land and whether or not things can be detected from the surface or not. The other form of remote sensing that has become very important recently, but it has been used for a number of years to help locate possible burials, are ground-based remote sensing methods. The most common that we're hearing about right now is ground penetrating radar, and I will focus on that in a couple of examples shortly. There are other forms of remote sensing that can be useful in locating unmarked graves. I won't go into detail on these right now, but the Canadian Archaeological Association will be providing some more specific guidelines for these other methods shortly. Briefly, ground penetrating radar has been around since certainly the 1970s. There's a long history of using this for a variety of reasons. Originally developed primarily to look for buried infrastructure and has been modified and adapted to potentially find smaller different types of disturbances, such as potential graves. It basically uses a radar or electromagnetic wave to send below the surface and scan the surface underneath the ground, where that wave will bounce back differently depending on what's underneath. So if there's a different type of soil, it will reflect differently. If there's a disturbance, it will reflect differently. If there's a rock or a pipe, it will reflect differently. So the researcher will see the reflection and then make an interpretation of what likely is underneath the surface. And it does provide information about depth, size, and the character of the disturbance. So we collect data. This is an example of what the data looks like. So it basically looks like a bunch of lines. These are the waves themselves reflecting from the antenna down and bouncing back. So we collect it, and we collect it in straight lines, usually when we're doing an intensive survey. We go from an image like this and we start to visualize what is it that we're seeing. And I'll say for graves, we're looking for the grave shaft. So we don't see remains, we don't see bodies, we may see the pit. And if there's a coffin, we may see a coffin reflection. That does sometimes occur. So we start to visualize what's happening, and then we try to interpret. What does that pit look like? How deep is it? And then when we collect multiple lines, we can think about how long is it? How big is it? And that can help us sometimes distinguish between, say, an adult or a child who may be in this possible grave. I want to emphasize that even with experience in doing ground penetrating radar, graves are challenging targets. So there are many, many factors which will determine whether or not ground penetrating radar is able to detect the grave shafts, or the researcher is able to interpret the results as graves. It really depends on the context. This method is best established in formal burial contexts. So where there are regular, rows and orientations, that makes it gives us more confidence. Areas that have, for example, marked graves, you can collect data over the marked graves and then apply that to unmarked areas, and that's building confidence that we may be finding graves. It works less well and is less well established in more informal burial grounds or clandestine graves. So a grave that's off by itself is more difficult to detect than a grave in a graveyard. So this does matter, and trying to figure out what those methods of burial were becomes very important. Preservation of the grave shaft will depend on the history of land use, the type of soil, what has happened since the burial happened, and so all that will really impact whether or not GPR is able to detect a possible grave. And these, of course, are very sensitive environments in which to work, and great care must be given to do the best possible methods and to apply these technologies in the most careful ways, and to not overstate what it is that we're actually finding. So a couple of limitations around ground penetrating radar, which I alluded to already, is that it's pretty good at the size, shape, and depth, but actually knowing what's underneath is always an interpretive leap. So in order for this to work, the ground penetrating radar unit has to ideally sit on the surface of the earth. So if there's any sort of bush or trees, it becomes more challenging to use. It needs to be very clear, and it's time consuming. It takes a lot of time. We can not cover very large areas in a day, so it may take days and days to cover or weeks even to cover acres of land. It doesn't work in all environments. It's very environmentally dependent. If there's a lot of clay, for example, the clay will actually suck in the signal, something we call attenuation, and we can't actually see below the surface very well. So different types of environments will have different applications of remote sensing, and GPR is not always the answer. And I also want to emphasize that while we can get pretty confident that what we're seeing is a grave, without further ground truthing of some kind, we cannot be 100% sure, because it always is an interpretation that we're being made. We can be very sure if we're in a formal burial ground, and we've seen many of these, but it's not 100% all the time. When there's ambiguity, it really is helpful to have other geophysical techniques to use. I'm not going to go into detail, but some of the other options include magnetic techniques, such as magnetic radiometry, which looks at changes in the magnetic field and may be able to detect metallic objects, such as coffin hardware. And then there's also resistivity or conductivity, which measures the way an electrical current goes through the ground and can sometimes also pick up difference and disturbance from possible grave shafts. Overall, ground-based methods are very useful in certain contexts. They're proven in formal cemeteries. They provide more detailed spatial information. Also note that just because any
Hello, it's Leo again. I think we lost a connection on this internet. Is Dr. Eldon Yellowhorn there, please? Dr. Eldon Yellowhorn.
Good afternoon. Do you see me okay?
Yes, we do.
Bonjour Léo, comment ça va?
Ça marche, ça marche. Welcome to the conversation.
Bon. I too have a PowerPoint presentation to do. Did you want me to introduce myself first?
Please do.
Oh, okay. Okay. Nistu ako kutskina. Nisipi kanikwan. At kainok nisitu topi amumilto yahki. Good afternoon. My name is Eldon Yellowhorn. I'm from the Piikani Nation. Although I'm from the plains, I now live on the west coast in the homeland of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam people. And I'm a professor at Simon Fraser University in the Department of Indigenous Studies. So I have a PowerPoint presentation to share. And are you able to see that?
Nope, not yet.
Oh, okay. Hold on a second. Something is. Okay, I'm having technical difficulties with my share feature. Well, this is odd. Well, it looks like my. Oh, here we go. Send. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm just kind of looking at you here. We're having some technical difficulties on the share screen side.
Eldon, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Maybe we can do it orally if we can't
Okay,
put
I'll
the.
do that. I'll do that instead.
Why not?
Because I was going to be talking about my own career in archaeology, and I can certainly do that. Yeah, so I started working in archaeology in 1980 as a part of an expedition into northern Alberta, and I've been participating in various researches ever since. When I became part of the faculty at Simon Fraser University in 2002, I started working on a historical archaeology project with Piikani Nation, which was where I'm from. And when I began working on that project, because historical archaeology was not something that generally Indigenous communities had much experience with. And certainly my own research interest was always in looking at ancient sites, at communal hunting sites, those places that we call buffalo jumps. That was always my interest in archaeology and communal hunting. And then I also did excavate some human remains, but whenever I did that, it was always like 2,000 years old or 3,000 years old. So it's great antiquity associated with them. But I began the historical archaeology project specifically because the Piikani Nation, where I'm from, there's not a lot of local history being done, and people don't really know too much about their own history. So I began to do the historical archaeology work there. And one of the sites that I excavated was the site of the Church of England residential school that was established on our reserve in 1892. And it operated there until 1927 when there was a new school built and people went to work at that one. So the site was then abandoned, and when we were working there, there was nothing there that was from the time period. So I continued working on this historical archaeology project, and in 2009, I was invited by the TRC to help out with their missing children's project. And this was, I was on a sabbatical year that 2009, 2010, so I had an opportunity to participate in the missing children's project. And what our job was to do was to travel around the country to the sites of where old residential schools had been located, and to look for the cemeteries that were associated with these schools and to report back on their condition. So we had an opportunity to travel to places such as Shubenacadie School in Nova Scotia, and we did a lot of work in Ontario. In Ontario, we had an opportunity to go to visit the Mount Elgin Industrial School, which was, well, we could consider it ground zero for the residential school experience, because this was the first residential school in operation in 1847, and it operated until 1946. It's located on the reserve of the Chippewa of the Thames, and this is a small community, so land is at a premium all the time. And so to set aside a small commemoration for the site was a big investment for the community. But they created on the site of the old school, there's only one structure that's still standing there. There's no barn, but they built a very nice memorial park there where they have these obelisks surrounding the central area, and the names of all the children who attended the school. And one obelisk is left blank for the children we'll never know about. From there, we also had a chance to go to places such as Spanish Ontario. And at Spanish Ontario, the two schools that were associated there, one was a boys' school and one was a girls' school. And the girls' school was run by the Grey Nuns, and the boys' school was run by the Jesuits. And they operated there for decades. But they have the cemetery that was associated with this school, with these schools, became the community cemetery for the whole modern community of Spanish Ontario. That's where that is the nucleus of their the community cemetery. And the children who were buried at this school don't really have any markers. If they did have markers, they were probably wooden markers that disappeared a long time ago. So more recently, people have put together a monument with all the names of the children who they know of who died at this residential school, and it's just one granite stone with the names on either side. But just looking through the names of the children, one of the big things that really struck me was the impact of the Spanish flu epidemic, and how that you could tell by the names on the plaque that the outbreak started in the girls' school, and then it was transmitted to the boys' school, because the names of the boys started appearing later than the girls. But there were some rather famous people who went to a Spanish Indian school. One was Basil Johnston, who wrote a memoir of this school called Indian School Days. And Basil Johnston was an anthropologist, and for many years he worked at the Royal Ontario Museum as an ethnographer. Another person who was very famous, who attended this school as a young girl, was Daphne Oceak. She just recently passed away in 2016. She was born in this area, and then later in her life, she was part of a group of artists known as the Indian Group of Seven, who revolutionized Indigenous art in Canada. And she attended the school for several years. And we also had a chance to visit Algoma University. And Algoma University is an interesting place because the main school was actually, or the main building on the school, it was actually part of a residential school. This was one that was built in the 1880s. It was following on Chief Shingwak, who was an Anishinaabe chief, Shingwak, who really wanted and develop a partnership with the Anglican priest there to develop what he called the teaching wigwam. And for a few years, it kind of operated in that style, but then eventually it kind of a new priest came in, and he didn't have the same vision as the fellow who was the founding minister. Today, the Algoma University incorporates the grounds of the old residential school. So there is actually a little cemetery right on the campus of Algoma University. One of the other sites that we visited was in northern Ontario, a place called Chapleau. And at the Chapleau, there was a residential school there. And this one, there was nothing remaining of the school. And even the cemetery had been overgrown by vegetation that when we went looking for it, we were actually bushwhacking our way through until we found the cemetery. But then afterwards, the Chapleau Cree First Nation took this on as a community project, and they turned it into a memorial park, which is still, it is today. You know, they had the forestry workers help to clear the land and then to identify where the graves were, and to build a little memorial to the children who were lost there. So I just want to wind up my own presentation with, there's a lot of anxiety about this issue, and everybody wants everything done last year. But this is the time to be patient, to be deliberative, and to take the long view. I think, rather than trying to make everything happen all at once, we should think in terms of maybe a 10-year plan or maybe a 20-year plan, where we have definable milestones that we will be better placed to bring a resolution to this question. And also at this time, I will also issue my own call to action. If young people are looking for a way to make a contribution, they can channel their energies into school and become the archaeologists, the forensic and physical anthropologists, and the geneticists who will shed light on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Dr. Eldon. Thank you very much. And welcome to this very important conversation that we're having today. I'd love to present right now Dr. Kona Williams. Dr. Kona Williams, s'il vous plaît.
Can anybody hear me?
I certainly can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
And you are on, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Bonsoir, everyone. My apologies for the crappy connection. I'm having technical difficulties. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Kona Williams. I'm First Nations. My dad was Cree from Peguis out in Manitoba, and he attended Birtle Residential School out that way.
Again.
My mom is my mom is Mohawk from Ganawage, just south of Montreal, and so I am somewhere in the middle. Right now, I am practicing out in Sudbury, and like I said, I'm a forensic pathologist. I'm also a coroner and the lab medical director for Health Sciences North. And I am the new director for the Northeastern Regional Ontario Forensic Unit. So I have a bit of a different perspective. So as a forensic pathologist, that means that I'm a medical doctor. And I am responsible for collecting the medical and scientific information from bodies and performing the autopsy and trying to come to the closest approximation to the truth that I can about how somebody died. So when I first started hearing about residential schools way back when I was a teenager, and my father was part of the TRC, I wondered what might happen if we ever thought to start investigating these sites. And it's something that I have brought up with my colleagues now that I am a forensic pathologist, so my other forensic colleagues. So what are we going to do? What will be our approach? So lately, now that we do know that, we've known for a long time these sites exist, but now it's being brought to the forefront as we're starting to learn more about what and how many children these sites may contain. And for me, as a forensic pathologist, my job is to examine, any potential bones and bodies that get exhumed, and try to understand how that person might have died. Now, as we've probably heard, this is going to take a multidisciplinary approach in terms of a forensic investigation, but all of this needs to be done with and guided by the communities and the families, along with survivors and elders and leadership, with the proper ceremony and protocols, which, as we know, differs across the country for each community. So I'm able to offer the expertise that I have, but only with the permission of the communities and the families who wish to make use of that. So when I do get involved, and again, like I said, that will have to be dependent on what people wish. My job is to try and find a cause of death. And that could be quite easy, and in some cases it can be quite difficult. And like I said, I work with other forensic experts. So my archaeology colleagues, for example, are going to be very, very helpful. My forensic anthropology colleagues as well, to help us with the bones. And I would hope to lend my expertise to this. Now, I did have a little PowerPoint presentation prepared, and I'm not sure if that's able to be shared, but if not, I'm happy to just sort of go over it really quickly. It's very short. The forensic experts required would be, as I said, forensic pathologists, forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, geophysicists, geneticists, genealogists, a good number of experts. And as has been said before, this is not going to happen overnight. This is going to take many years for this to be done properly. I had recommended that an expert advisory panel be created, or an expert advisory committee be created to provide oversight and at an arm's length from organizations in government to also advise the families of what to do next once they've made a decision. The phases of this approach, the forensic approach, should we get involved, again, driven by family, community, leadership, the engagement must be there. There must be some oversight. The communication must be very, very, very clear at all stages of the process, depending on what people want. There need to be local action plans, ethics, ceremony. There's a lot that needs to be done in order to, before we start excavating, if that's what's going to happen. And in order for me to do my work, I need documents. So when I perform an autopsy on a person, I usually have information about them in life. And that can mean anything from their medical history to fingerprints, dental records, etc., which help me understand them in death and also help me identify them. Now, unfortunately, that's not always going to be possible with these children if all we're dealing with are bones, and we may not have that information, in which case the collection of DNA from living family members becomes essential if we want to identify these children. That process itself is going to require ethics, proper collection, proper extraction, etc., and then matching of these, the DNA from living relatives to those of the deceased. And again, this can't be forced, and there has to be very, very clear sort of instructions about what to do with this information, and that it's not going to be used for anything else. The identification obviously becomes very important, and then potential repatriation or sending these children home. But there are difficult questions that need to be, and difficult discussions that need to be had before this happens. So for example, the management of unidentified remains. So what do we do with the children, the bones, and we're not able to identify them? What do we do if there are children from different communities buried at one site, and the communities have opposing views about what they wish to do? So for example, if there may be a large spectrum of wishes from communities, everything from it's enough to know where they are and set up a memorial and honor them that way, all the way to a full forensic investigation, including exhumation and identification and repatriation of the remains. What do you do when there are children from both communities and they have the opposite wishes and made the opposite decision. So those are discussions that are going to have to be had by communities. And again, the wishes of the families and communities are paramount, and the extent of our involvement in terms of forensic pathology depends on what they decide. There needs to be a systematic approach to the forensic work should they choose to go that route. And we do have international best practices that align with the ethics and the obligations to both the living and the dead. There must be some respect, or there has to be respect for the ceremonies and protocols and traditions and values of each community along the way. This is going to be very hard work, not just for people like me, but it's also going to be difficult on the community members. I would expect that mental health supports, emotional, would be put in place before a shovel ever hits the ground. And one thing that needs to be very clear is the limitations about what it is that we can do. So it may not be possible to locate all grave sites. It may not be possible to locate every child.
Just left. No sound.
Kona can speak.
Hello, Dr. Kona. Can you speak? We just lost your single. Hello, Dr. Williams. We lost your single. Pardon. Hello, everybody. It's me again. It's Leo in Winnipeg. We lost a single with Dr. Williams. And again, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Dr. Williams, for joining our very important conversation that we're having today. If we go to our questions, our first one is to Raymond Frogner, the head of archives at the NCTR. And I would like Raymond to share a little bit about his work being done at the center related to the Missing Children Project, what activities are being conducted, why should communities work with the center, and what can records assist in searching for missing children and unmarked burials. Raymond, la parole est à toi. It's all yours, Raymond.
Okay, merci, Leo. Those are a lot of big questions. I'd like to first begin by just pointing out that our speakers today gave very powerful arguments and made really strong cases for the investigation of these unmarked grave sites. And because of the strength of those presentations, I think that adds value to the need for their long-term preservation. So as these projects are being launched, the plans and guidelines are being written, I would like to stress the need to have a long-term plan, which we can supply at the NCTR to ensure that these investigations, the records that are resulting from these investigations, are preserved for future generations. It's a common rule of thumb that if there is going to be a project with a high volume of digital material, then the plans for the preservation of that material begins at the point of their creation. So I just want to stress that up clearly. As far as what is the NCTR doing at the moment, when I mentioned that we had a CFI, there are several large-scale projects that are being done in that one. And perhaps our most important is working with the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy and to look at the legacy of childhood trauma in the records. So what we're doing with the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy is we are sharing with them some of our archival records in an anonymized way, and they are using those anonymized records to trace the experiences of later generations of intergenerational survivors of residential schools, and statistically to look at the long-term health, education, welfare legacies of childhood trauma that has affected these families. This is a very large-scale project that will take years, but it's also internationally unique in the way that it will be plotting the long-term legacies of this childhood trauma in a very statistical and detailed way. So that is one of the biggest projects. Another is working with the NFB to ensure that the testimonies that the people such as Leo collected is preserved, is made accessible, searchable, and usable for future generations. And again, that is a long-term project, considering that there was over 7,000 statements gathered during the time of the TRC. It's an enormous project to ensure that all of the various formats of those recordings will be preserved. And why should communities be interested in working with the NCTR for this work? I did suggest some of the reasons in my presentation, and most significantly is that we can enable communities to go forward with their own self-determined investigations and ensure that the research that they're working on, the data that they're collecting and using in their daily investigation is consistent, is reliable, it's trustworthy, and they can share it within the community while they can share it effectively in their community while they're doing their research. This is completely under the guidance of the communities themselves. It will always be the data will always be under the sovereignty of those communities, but we can ensure that the costs, the systems maintenance, all of the other overheads that would go into making this a successful investigation could be managed by the NCTR free of charge, as part of our mandate to support Indigenous communities in their efforts to gain a greater degree of sovereignty and self-determination in their life paths. I think that's the main points. Is there anything else, Leo? Did I forget something?
No, tout est bon. Tout est bon.
Oh, merci beaucoup.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is
Yes.
all technical for me, so I'm having a couple of challenges here. And thank you very much, Raymond. And I love the idea, by the way, if I can just mention this, about the NFB, National Film Board, l'Office National du Film. And I think the NFB a found a new raison d'être. Our second question would be to invite Dr. Kona Williams to share information related to her work. What might exhumation of unmasked graves look like, and how can forensic pathology be used to support the search for missing children and unmarked burials? Dr. Kona, s'il vous plaît. So we're going to go to Dr. Eldon Yellowhorn. When did you visit the, Sadbenachi IRS? Did you meet survivors from Spikene? And I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Dr. Eldon, are you there?
You can hear me okay? Oh, suddenly. Well, I was visiting at the Shubenacadie residential school in 2011. Yeah, I had the great pleasure to meet with Isabel Knockwood. She was our guide who showed us around the community and introduced us to other people who attended the school. She herself attended the school in the early 1940s. And I was very sad to learn recently that she had passed away. We had an opportunity to visit the cemetery at Shubenacadie to see if there were any burials there, but we didn't find any. Yeah, even the school at Shubenacadie burnt down in the, I think, 1990s or 1980s. And today there's a plastic factory built on the footprint of the old residential school. Yeah, I kept in contact with Isabel because I also got to know her brother, Noel Knockwood, from other work I did in Ottawa at the Museum of History. Thank you.
What? I have to get back on the street.
Hello, Kona. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. So tell us, the unmarked graves exhumation. What would it look like? And can you tell us more about forensic pathology to be used to support the search for these missing children, our missing children, and the unmarked burials?
Yes, so the excavation or exhumation itself will likely be led by archaeologists and forensic anthropologists. And my job comes in when I start to examine the bones themselves. So we don't even know what these sites are going to look like, but the scenes themselves, the sites themselves, are extremely important to the work that I do. So it's not just looking at bones, it's also where are these sites located? What is at these sites? What can we learn from the site so that it can tell us a little bit more about what may have happened to them? So for these cases, for these children, it may be just as important, the site, the scene itself, as the bones themselves. So that's why I said it's a multidisciplinary team. We need to work together in order to do this properly and do it the right way.
Hello, Kona.
Yes.
We have an additional question. Someone was wondering if these forensic experts in Canada might have been in contact with or sought advice from forensic anthropology teams from other countries, for example, Argentina.
So we do have forensic experts here in Canada. We actually have even some Indigenous forensic experts, which is even better. But we are a small community, and we are in contact with other countries, including, overseas in the U.S. And so the forensic experts, such as the forensic anthropologists that I work with regularly, they have international expertise. And so their knowledge and expertise is in high demand. They've been to places like Bosnia or Kuala Lumpur, Haiti. So their expertise is requested all over the world. So we do have that right here in Canada. But the sheer magnitude of the work involved, like I said, it's going to take many years, and we may require support from international agencies.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You can hear me? Our next question would be to Dr. Kisha Supernant. The question is, how can archaeology and anthropology be used for the search of these missing children in unmarked burials? And what can archaeologists do to support the work in the communities? Merci.
Yes, thank you, Leo. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, perfect. So first, I want to thank the other panelists for their contributions and sort of reemphasize some of the things that we've heard, that there needs to be coordination and there needs to be an emphasis on supporting communities in all of the different aspects of this work, from the archaeological applications to the forensic side to the community engaged work. I think in terms of what archaeologists can potentially bring, I mean, there's been important emphasis that these shouldn't be considered as archaeological sites, but there are techniques that are used in archaeology that can benefit in locating and potentially exhuming these unmarked grave locations. And so the remote sensing work that I had talked about, so there are people who know how to use remote sensing techniques. Ground penetrating radar, for example, is used extensively in industry. What archaeology can do is help to apply it in a specific way, because the most experience in doing work around unmarked graves and cemeteries and other contexts in Canada is held by archaeologists who have worked for Indigenous communities and with Indigenous communities on these unmarked grave places. So a lot of the specific application of these technologies is been done by archaeologists. And so therefore, I think that experience provides an important set of information. So even when someone from industry or someone who's a geophysicist who may have deep knowledge of the technology itself comes in, the archaeologists can help to say, well, this is how we apply the techniques specifically for unmarked burials. The other area I think archaeology can support is that over the past 25 years, more and more archaeologists have spent time becoming better relations with Indigenous communities. So for a long time, of course, archaeology was not always a good relation, but folks such as Eldon, breaking the path for more Indigenous archaeologists, and also non-Indigenous archaeologists working with and in collaboration with communities, that has given a number of us the experience of why it's so important to listen to the community first and not just go in with the importance of doing all of the background work that is needed before we're even out on the ground. I think archaeologists have more experience in doing that than in some other areas. So the development of these best practices, I think, is really key, and we are working, a group of us collaboratively on doing that, and then also connecting with geophysicists and forensic anthropologists and historians to try to ensure that communities are resourced. but there is a real need for coordination of these experts, right? So we're doing it all now kind of ourselves, coming together, trying to do the best we can. But I think coming back to a point that Dr. Williams had brought up, which is there is a role for an expert advisory panel of people who know different aspects of this work at arm's length that can be a reliable source of information for Indigenous communities. So when they're, say, being approached by a company to do some element of the work, they know where to go to get expert advice that's reliable and that's consistent, because there's a lot of moving parts right now. And I think one of the other main messages is this will take time, and it needs to take time. It is urgent, but it should not necessarily be rushed, because rushing could lead to communities getting inaccurate information, for example, from someone who doesn't necessarily know how to apply ground penetrating radar. So I think many of these things are important, and ways in which the disciplines of anthropology and archaeology can support communities in this difficult work. Oh, Leo, I think you're still muted.
Pardon. Thank you very much. I'm getting to know this system. I should mention something that's very, very important for all of us to note, that there is a residential school crisis line. So if people are having issues, they're having triggers, here's the number, and I'll repeat it a couple of times. It's 1-866-925-4419. Je répète, 1-866-925-4.
Again, the crisis line is 1-866-925-4419.
4419. I think we're almost at the end. Maybe back to Raymond. What do communities need to know before they begin their search of residential school grounds? What are they doing during, and what do they do after? Raymond, la parole est à toi.
Merci, Leo. I think that, and some of my colleagues have pointed this out already in their presentations, there is a significant need to have a historical context, a background understanding to these investigative sites before launching into on-the-ground ground penetrating radar, shovels in the ground excavations, those kinds of things. There are, as I've said, we're sitting on 5 million documents that have recorded the residential school history of these schools. And I think before any sort of investigation in the ground is initiated, there needs to be a significant historical background research into the evidence of those schools. The evidence of missing children, the names of the children that have lost that we have been able to identify, for example, on our memorial site, that can be used as part of the research into just what is the identity of these children. And of course, as I've said before, the long-term preservation of this work so that, future generations can refer to it, that it's not lost, that in the words of the Joanne Orlinker principles, there is a right to remember, and that right to remember is safeguarded.
Hello, Raymond, you're still with us. Hello, Raymond?
I'm back.
Okay, we have an additional question, hoping that the archivist might comment on the Oblate joint statement, disclosure of records as far as the Dead Missing Children project is concerned, especially in the light of the discovery of unmarked graves.
Right, that's a good and very vital question. Since the Kamloops announcement, we have been in discussion with the Oblates on the question of the records that document the history of residential schools and the Oblate Order's involvement in the operations of those schools. We had multiple meetings where we were finally able to conclude with them that the Oblates would make available accessible all of the records they hold that are related to residential school history. So that includes the Codex Historicus, photographs, staff records, all kinds of documents any kind of document they hold. So that is the reason why we made that public statement to make sure that there is a public announcement, not just a legal agreement, but also a public recognition that they have agreed to open all of their records in all of the sites. So since then, we've been working with several different other repositories, the Société Historique de Saint-Boniface, for example, where we're making plans to now identify, arrange, describe, and digitize so that they can be brought into the NCTR, all the records that still exist that have not been acquired for this kind of research. But it must be added, I must add to that one important detail. We have now received the Oblate's sanction to acquire these records, to make copies and acquire them, but we still don't have an agreement on who's paying for it. At the moment, we have graciously agreed to cover the costs because we recognize the value of getting copies and making these records accessible, particularly given the urgency of the times that we're living in right now. But given the fact that we recognize that the Catholic Church, not the Oblates, but the Catholic Church themselves, never did follow through on their agreement to pay the money that they agreed to in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, I think this might be a good opportunity for the Catholic Church administration to step forward and open up the wallets and start recognizing the cost of making these digital copies available at the NCTR. I think that's where we stand with the Oblates. But it should be pointed out there's lots of different other records that we have yet to acquire, coroner's reports from the various provincial governments, the statistical analysis of the IAP reports, which we're still in court with Canada to try to acquire, vital stats records from various provinces. These are all important records that helped to tell the story of the loss of these children. Leo,
Merci.
Is that okay?
Yeah, merci Raymond.
Ça va?
And
Merci.
this is an open question to all the other doctors. What level of security will be needed for the sites as they are undertaken for those that may not agree to these tasks? Open question to all participants.
I mean, I can maybe start, and I certainly would invite other panelists to weigh in as well. I think we have been seeing, that there are folks who deny kind of the impacts of this or don't necessarily want the evidence to come to light. And I think it's really important that throughout the entire process of collecting information on the ground, whether that be the work of people like myself with ground penetrator radar, but especially if there's any exhumation doing, is that there needs to be kind of a constant surveillance, because I think this is really important, and making sure that any evidence that is being gathered is being protected as needed. So it's a very important element to this, I think.
Hello, can you hear me okay? I can add to that. One thing we really stress is community buy-in, having very, very close communications with the host community, making sure that the community is on board with everything you're doing, and having the support of that in the project, because this is something that really requires everybody to work together. And I know there's a group there's always somebody who will be protesting, and I think the best way to deal with that, rather than having to provide security or something, is to reach out to those people and find out exactly what is it that they can't agree to, and see if there's any kind of space for compromise or to come together on some agreement. Thank you.
For more of a forensic perspective, when we're dealing with scenes, especially if there's some potential criminality involved, we do they are held or securely held. And this in my case would involve police to secure the scene and secure the site until the work at the scene is completed and the necessary information has been gathered. This is generally quite expensive because it is 24 hours. So I'm not sure if there's other ways of making sure that these sites are preserved to ensure that the information that we need to gather from them is intact.
Thank you very much. We have another question. I hope you can all hear me. What would happen when exhuming bodies that have passed away from contagious illnesses? Does that pose a risk to those working with these persons? Open to all.
I can start here. The idea of catching like a virus from corpses is very limited. I think the more concern that people would have in exhuming is, say, fungus in the soil or other bacteria in the soil. But I don't think the catching anything from deceased is a concern.
Anybody else would like to participate in this question?
Yes. So when I do my examinations on the deceased, I'm wearing full protective equipment because you never know what might be carried in the bodies or within the bodies. Now, a particular concern is tuberculosis. Now, that mainly affects the lungs, although it does affect other organs, including bones. So I would expect that there would be some level of personal protective equipment that anybody working at this sites would use to ensure that nothing is transmitted.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. I think this could be our last question. It's call to action number 74 and number 75 actually demand the Canadian government, and I think they're listening tonight, the Canadian government to lead and assist in the identification of unmarked graves. Are the indigenous communities undertaking this action? Are Canadians taking this action? Is that correct? And if yes, what does that say about the Canadian reconciliation efforts? Open to all.
I can lead the discussion here. There's certainly the case, that Indigenous communities have to take the lead on these questions. And, people like Kisha and myself are certainly there to help out because we're in a unique position to move these kinds of questions along because we work in research intensive environments where we are expected to have a research program. And this is certainly part of my own program now because as a PhD and holding a faculty position in a research intensive university, I can apply to for funding from agencies such as the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And in fact, I currently have a grant, I'm holding a grant for precisely this reason, working with the Brandon Indian Residential School and the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation. So this is something that the community is at the forefront of and is leading and demonstrating as an example to other communities.
Any other comments from our participants?
If that's okay, Leo?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think it necessarily has to be a community-led approach. The era of a national federal program, some kind of universal program that's going to resolve the situation, I think we need to put that behind us. That was the era that ran these residential schools in the first place. The universal solutions should be, put to rest. So we should start turning to the needs of the local communities and let them decide on their own needs for themselves.
Dr. Kona, any final comments from you, please?
Yeah, so absolutely, the communities need to decide what it is that how they want to proceed. But with that, they need the right information in order to make those decisions. So I'm hoping that by tonight, more communities and more families will have that information, or at least know where to start. As we all know, the very few of the recommendations from the TRC have been implemented. So I would hope that these important ones regarding the grave sites, would then now be implemented after how many years, and that, yes, communities need to drive this in terms of what they want to do, but at the same time, the funding for this needs to be available in order to do this work properly. It's going to take a long time, and it's not going to be, we don't want it done cheaply. We want it done properly. We want it done the right way in order to honor these children.
Yes, and if I could just follow up on that briefly. I think I really want to support what both of my colleagues have said, is that communities must determine what needs to be done and bring together survivors and families and connect, but they must be resourced, and resources is funding, but it's also expertise, right? And folks who've done this, that they have access to the technical expertise, they understand the different elements of the process, and that's not evenly shared among communities right now. So those who have partnerships may have folks that they can rely on to give them information, but there's not a coordination of that information, like Dr. Williams was saying. So from my perspective, the role of the Canadian government is to ensure the communities have everything they need to be able to do this work, that they're being given the money, the expertise, the access to the resources needed, and that the communities are the only ones who can say that the work is done, right? That these calls to action have been met, and that will take a long time. They need to be continually resourced in order to be able to do that. And there is a role, I think, for the government to play.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all participants. Again, very important, the residential school crisis phone line, 866-925-4419, 866-925-4419. So on behalf of the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation, I'd love to thank Raymond, Kona, Kisha, and Eldon for joining us today. I've learned a lot of things. A good way for members is to contact you. They can find you. A little personal note, I spent 5 years with the TRC. With Murray and Marie and Wilton, I gotta say, it was the best job of my life. Thank you to all. Merci. And stay in touch with the NCTR for dialogue, and we hope to see you all again. Merci, miigwech. Miigwech.